I want to invite you this evening to open up to 2 Corinthians chapter 10 as at least a beginning place tonight, 2 Corinthians chapter 10. And as you're turning there, I want to start with a question for you. What is the goal of the Christian life? What is it that we're to become as disciples of Jesus? There may be several ways we could answer that question. It seems to me that the New Testament itself addresses that question in a variety of ways. But in our study this evening, I'd like for us to look at the way that Paul answered that as he wrote this second letter to the church in Corinth. And as we look at what Paul wrote, what we're going to find is that Paul's comments along these lines actually come within the context of some comments that he made that were in defense of his ministry as an apostle. He was defending himself as an apostle of Christ. And one thing you can't help but notice when you read through 2 Corinthians is that there were people who were being critical of the apostle Paul and questioning even his apostleship. It tells us that not even apostles were spared from that kind of thing. And his critics were saying things like here in chapter 10 and verse 10, his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech of no account. In other words, he's not much to look at, and he's not much to hear, but he can sure write a mean letter, and that's kind of what they're saying. And so it was an entirely worldly evaluation of Paul's work. And so Paul spent some time defending himself and actually other faithful preachers of the gospel in this letter that he wrote to the Corinthians. And he didn't do it for his own sake. It wasn't because he had been insulted personally, like, how dare you question me, I'm the Apostle Paul, but rather for the sake of the effectiveness of his work. And the criticisms that he was receiving, at the very least, what they demonstrated was a lack of understanding and a lack of maturity on the part of those who were offering them. And there was also a significant chance that they would influence other people as well. And that would hinder the gospel. If people didn't listen to the Apostle Paul and take these things that came directly from God through the Holy Spirit, it would hinder their relationship with the Lord. And so it wasn't about Paul, it was about the gospel of Christ. And he didn't want the gospel to be hindered in some way as a result of the misunderstandings of misguided people. But as Paul addressed this problem, he said some things about the goal of the Christian life. He tells us how it is that we're to work toward that goal, or toward the goal that God has in mind for each one of us, for all of us. And in some ways, the passage that we're going to look at this evening it's kind of difficult to understand, but it's one that's really worth the effort, because it addresses some things that are at the very heart of what it means to be a disciple of Christ. Things I think that are frequently missing in discussions today about what it means to be a Christian. And so although we'll primarily be looking at what Paul said in just one verse, actually I'm going to have you turn to chapter 3 now. That'll be the last verse of chapter 3. I'd like for us to begin reading earlier in the chapter just to kind of place it in context. And in fact, I want us to go ahead and take the time to read the entire chapter. And I'd like for us to do that because although Paul will change the subject to some degree at the end of the chapter, what he said at the end of the chapter is going to be framed in language that he uses throughout the chapter. So it's kind of beneficial to look at all of that. And so really, at the beginning of the chapter, we're already breaking into mid-thought. Chapter divisions are not always, hard and fast. And so we start out with a question that presumes other things, but let's just start there. Are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Or do we need, as some do, letters of recommendation to you or from you? You yourselves are our letter of recommendation, written on our hearts to be known and read by all. And you show that you are a letter from Christ, delivered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. Such is the confidence that we have through Christ toward God. Not that we are sufficient in ourselves to claim anything as coming from us, but our sufficiency is from God, who has made us sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now, if the ministry of death, carved in letters on stone, came with such glory that the Israelites could not gaze at Moses' face because of its glory, which was being brought to an end, will not the ministry of the Spirit have even more glory? For if there was glory in the ministry of condemnation, the ministry of righteousness must far exceed it in glory. Indeed, in this case, what once had glory has come to have no glory at all because of the glory that surpasses it. For if what was being brought to an end came with glory, much more will what is permanent have glory. Since we have such hope, we are very bold. Not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face so that the Israelites might not gaze at the outcome of what was being brought to an end. But their minds were hardened. For to this day, when they read the Old Covenant, that same veil remains unlifted, because only through Christ is it taken away. Yes, to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts. But when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. And now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another, for this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. Now, I'm glad I don't have to talk about all of that tonight, because there's a lot going on there in this chapter. But the first thing that I do want us to see this evening and want us to talk about this evening is the fact that the Christian life is one of transformation. That's ultimately what Paul gets to by the end of this chapter. As he says there in verse 18, we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. Now, we don't have to understand everything that's found there to understand that we're being transformed. That's what Paul says. And the word that Paul used in this verse that is translated by the word transformed, it simply means to change into another form. I mean, obviously, that's what the word transform means as well. And it is the Greek word from which we get the English word metamorphosis. We use that word, for example, to describe what happens when a caterpillar changes into a butterfly. There is a complete change there. There's a complete transformation that takes place. This is the same word that was used for what happened to Jesus in Matthew chapter 17, when he took Peter, James, and John up on a high mountain about a week after Peter had confessed that he was the Christ, the Son of the living God, the event that we typically refer to as the Transfiguration here in Matthew 17. And Matthew tells us there in chapter 17 and verse 2 that Jesus was transfigured. You could translate it transformed if you were of the mind to do so. He was transformed before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. What does all that mean? Well, it just means that his appearance changed in some way. And the passage we're looking at this evening is not the only one in the New Testament that applies this kind of concept, this idea of transformation to Christians. There are others as well. It's the same word that Paul uses. For example, in Romans chapter 12 and verse 2, when he would say to them, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Same word being used there. And so when we become Christians, we are to think differently about things. And that change in our thinking is going to help us live differently in some way, to be transformed completely, to be completely different people than we were before we obeyed the gospel of Christ. But let me ask you this. What is the goal of this transformation? What are we trying to look like? You know, if we're changing, what's the end product going to look like? The short answer to that is we're trying to look like Jesus. Paul said that in verse 18, 2 Corinthians 3, verse 18, that we, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image. What image? The image that we're beholding, the glory of the Lord. And so in the next chapter, Paul is going to talk about, in chapter 4 and verse 4, he's going to talk about seeing the light of the gospel and the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. So we're trying to be like Christ, like God. And so we're looking at the glory of Christ that is revealed in the gospel, and we are being changed by it to be more like Jesus. That's ultimately what Paul is telling us. And one thing we would do well to recognize is that this is not really an optional thing for people who are disciples of Christ. I think Paul, at the very least, alludes to that fact that this transformation is for all of us, and that we're all supposed to experience when he says there in 2 Corinthians 3 and verse 18 that we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image. It's not like some of you are doing this, and others not so much. No, this is for everybody. He didn't say that it's for a select few. It's for everybody. He didn't say that, some of you are being transformed and, some of you have been baptized at some point in the past, and that's great at least. That's not it. There's a transformation for everybody here. And the implication means that we are all supposed to experience this same thing. I wonder how many people realize that when they sign up so to speak, when they choose to obey the gospel of Christ, when they become Christians. I suspect sometimes that people just think, I just want to have my sins forgiven. I'm not really interested in all that extra stuff, Well, what Paul tells us here is it's not really extra stuff. It's at the very heart of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. As Christ himself would say in Luke chapter 6 and verse 40, a disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. That's the goal of the instruction that we receive. That's the goal of the disciple of Christ, to be like Jesus. And something else Paul seems to suggest in all of this is that this transformation that he was talking about, it's not a snap your fingers and it's a done kind of thing. It's a process. It's not something that happens all at once. And so he didn't say there that we have been transformed. He said that we are being transformed. And so he uses the present tense because he's describing an ongoing process. We are continually being transformed, or that's the way it's supposed to go. And so at the very least, this is implied in some other passages. It's implied in the words that we read of Jesus a moment ago in Luke chapter 6 and verse 40, that a disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. That full training is going to take some time. And so we could describe our lives as Christians in a number of different ways, but we could certainly do worse than to say that we are in training to be like Jesus. That's what this life is all about. Is that how we think of it? Is that the aim of what we do, that we are in training to be like Jesus? Because that's it. It's what it means to be a Christian. And you see that same kind of thing in the commission that Jesus gave to the apostles just before he ascended back to heaven in Matthew chapter 28 and verses 18 and following. We're familiar with it. He says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you." And we go to that passage and we want to show our religious friends that it teaches that people are to be baptized, and it does do that. But it also teaches that those who are baptized are to be taught to observe everything that he commanded. So that they were to make disciples, and then they were to teach these disciples to observe what the Lord commanded. And whatever else you might want to say about that, that doesn't sound like an overnight process. And so in light of these things, one question we can ask is this: are we more like Jesus today than we were yesterday? Will we be more like Jesus tomorrow than we are today? That's what each of us needs to aim for as we go about living our lives. And one thing we need to recognize is that when this transformation is not taking place, when there's not any progress along those lines, there's a problem there. And we know that the problem is not on the Lord's end. He's provided everything we need for this. If there's a problem, it's on our end. The Christian life is meant to be one of transformation. But the second thing I want to point out this evening is that Paul tells us that this transformation that we've been talking about, it comes from what we behold or what we contemplate, some translations say. Verse 18, "We all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another." And one thing Paul was trying to get across in these words is that, unlike the Israelites in Moses' day or those who didn't believe in Paul's day, there's not really anything getting in the way of us seeing the Lord's glory clearly. And that it's more than just a passing glimpse. It's not like we just get a glimpse of the Lord and, that's all we've got to go on. We're able to look upon the Lord's glory continually, he's saying. And the significance, if you look at what he talks about here, he talks about a veil, and the significance of the veil in this passage is that it keeps people from seeing things clearly. It gets in the way, so to speak. And that really seems to be the only purpose that Paul has in mind when he chose to use that as an image. And when you look at this chapter, you kind of see that the veil moves around a little bit. Up in verse 13, it's on the face of Moses, and then Paul talks about it being on the hearts of those who haven't accepted the gospel. There's something getting in the way there is the point. And the thing that he is saying to us, those of us who live on this side of things, those who are disciples of Christ, is that we don't have one. We get a clear view. In verse 16, when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. It's not there. We see the glory of the Lord clearly. And so we have a clear view of the Lord's glory because that veil is removed. But really, there's even more to it than that. He says, with unveiled faces, Paul talks about, we are beholding the glory of the Lord. And that word he uses there, beholding, is interesting. It indicates more than just a passing glimpse. On the contrary, we're able to look upon it continually. It's not a temporary thing. And that seems to be the idea that Paul is trying to get across. Some translations say that we are beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord. And that entire expression, beholding as in a mirror, actually comes from the one Greek word that Paul uses here. You know, typically when we look in a mirror, there's a purpose for doing that, isn't there? And more often than not, when we look in a mirror, we do so with the intention of contemplating what we see. At the very least, some aspect of what we see. And so we don't typically glance at a mirror casually, no purpose at all. When we look into a mirror, we're looking at something intently. And that's the point that Paul seems to be trying to get across here. It's more than just a quick glance at the glory of the Lord that's under consideration. We're looking upon the Lord's glory intently. In fact, the latest edition of the New International Version says that we contemplate the Lord's glory. We reflect upon what we see. You could even say that we meditate upon it. Or do we? Do we really? You see, in our fast-paced world, this is something that's often neglected. When we neglect it, though, we rob ourselves. I doubt that we can expect to be changed much by nothing more than a few momentary glances at the Lord's glory every now and then. It's something we must truly take the time to contemplate in the way that we should. That's the image that Paul is setting forth here. But let me take a moment just to ask you a question. What is it we're really talking about here? I mean, contemplating the Lord's glory and all that, what does that mean? How is it that we're able to even see that? And we're not talking about physically, obviously. We don't literally see the Lord's glory. So in what way do we behold it? Paul doesn't really answer that in chapter 3, but then again, Paul didn't write this letter with chapter divisions, did he? We put those in there. And so we just continue reading into the next chapter. What Paul tells us is that we see this glory in the gospel of Christ. He says there in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 4, the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. And the implication of that is that those of us who are believers, we do see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ. But the point I'm trying to make right now is that we see the glory of Christ in the Gospels. When we look at that message, when we go to the book and we contemplate what's found there, that's where it is. And the reason Paul even began talking about seeing the Lord's glory is because he was contrasting the experience of Moses and the children of Israel in the giving of the old covenant with what we have under the new covenant. And so what was experienced by Moses and the children of Israel? When you go back and you look at those things, it was truly remarkable. If you've been in the class that deals with Exodus and Leviticus, we covered this at one point in time. Let's go back to Exodus chapter 33 for just a moment. Let's read a few verses from that chapter. Exodus chapter 33 and verse 18. Moses would say to God there, please show me your glory. And he said, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim before you my name, Yahweh, and I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. But he said, you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live. And the Lord said, behold, there is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock, and while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face you shall not, or my face shall not be seen. And then in chapter 34, let's read a few more verses. In verse 29, Moses has this experience, and then he goes back down the mountain. And when, verse 29 of chapter 4, when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand as he came down from the mountain, Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because he had been talking with God. It's glowing. Aaron and all the people of Israel saw Moses, and behold, the skin of his face shone, and they were afraid to come near him. But Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the elders of the congregation returned to him. And Moses talked with them. And afterward all the people of Israel came near, and he commanded them all that the Lord had spoken with him on Mount Sinai. And when Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. And when Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he would remove the veil until he came out. And when he came out and told the people of Israel what he was commanded, the people of Israel would see the face of Moses, that the skin of Moses' face was shining, and Moses would put the veil over his face again until he went in to speak with him. Now here's the point. Here's the point Paul is making, is that us, under the new, you think about that experience, think, man, that would have been a remarkable thing to see. But what Paul's saying is that we have something even more remarkable than that under the new covenant. To borrow the language of Paul, it's in the light of the gospel that we truly behold the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. As John would say in John chapter 1 and verse 18, no one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father. He's made him known. Jesus made God known to us. And the way he did it, here's the thing. Here's how Jesus made God known to us. By simply being himself. Because that's who he was. In Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1, long ago at many times and in many ways God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he's spoken to us by his Son. Who is this Son? It's the Son that he appointed heir over all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God in the exact imprint of his nature. That's who Jesus is. And as I said earlier, it's not that we see the glory of the Lord physically. We see it in the message of the gospel, and that message is what transforms us, or it should. Wouldn't be surprised if there are people who try to make that transformation that's talked about here, mystical in some way, especially in light of the fact that in verse 18, Paul talks about this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit, and they want to make that all mystical. Or this is the working of the Spirit of the Lord, as one translation puts it. But as we noticed at the beginning of the lesson, Paul is making these statements in the context of his work as an apostle. That work that consisted of preaching the gospel that had been revealed by the Holy Spirit. And when you look at the things that Paul says in chapter 4, you kind of get a better understanding of just exactly what it is he's talking about. In verse 1 of chapter 4, therefore, having this ministry by the mercy of God, we do not lose heart, but we have renounced disgraceful, underhanded ways. We refuse to practice cunning or to tamper with God's word. But by the open statement of the truth, we would commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. That's the message that changes us. It takes us and it transforms us. It helps us to be more like Jesus if we take it seriously. And so the continuous and progressive transformation that Paul talks about, a transformation in which we as believers are changed from one degree of glory to another. It is a moral transformation. It takes place in our lives so that we resemble more and more the likeness of God that is expressed so perfectly in the life of Jesus Christ. And as Paul would say when he wrote one of his other letters, there are people, he would say in Ephesians 4 and verse 18, people who are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, due to their hardness of heart. They have become callous and have given themselves up to sensuality, greedy to practice every kind of impurity. But then he says to us, but that is not the way you learned Christ, assuming that you have heard about him and were taught in him, as the truth is in Jesus, to put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through deceitful desires, and to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to put on the new self. What's this new self? It's created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. That's what we're aiming at. Here's the point. Don't choose the darkness. Choose to be transformed by the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, because that is what it means to be a Christian. That's what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. If you're here tonight and we can help you in some way, maybe you've never obeyed the gospel, we want to talk to you about that. we want you to do that, not because we want you to, but because we believe that that's God's will for you. And if there's some way that we can help you in that regard, maybe you've done that at some point and there's other ways that you need help in your walk with the Lord, we want to help you. So if we can do that tonight, we ask you to come as we stand and as we sing.